For those of you who usually on Thursday nights have been following the fact that I was retiring this year, so for those of you who remember that, I am now officially retired as assistant principal. Woo! I gotta be honest, it was a bit bittersweet saying goodbye to some of the students. Some of the students were glad I was leaving, but no, it was very bittersweet. But it was good. It was good to say goodbye to some of the people that I've worked with for 16 years as well. So for those of you who are seeing the PowerPoint and figuring that I misspelled that, hold on. Just so you know, I know that was your initial thing is like, okay, he left the school, now he can't spell. So I want to talk a little bit first. So we're talking about historical markers. I love historical markers. I'm the guy, as you're driving down the highway and you see this sign, I'm the guy that slows down and pulls over and reads all of the signs. I love that. I mean, I have always been a student of history. I love reading about history, but there's something about being in the exact spot. So earlier it was last month, 2 months ago, we were in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And little did I know that there was a place called Glorieta Pass. And we stopped and pulled over, and did you know that the Gettysburg of the West was fought in Santa Fe, New Mexico, just outside? But we stopped and read about it. It was actually a turning point in the battle between the North and the South in the Southwest United States. But we stopped and we read about it. We went and looked at some of the ruins outside of that. The other thing we did a couple of years ago is we went and we had read books on the Oregon Trail. So we went to all of these places where you could actually see the trail still existing. And you could see the trail, the wagon tracks in the dirt, always dug into the rock. How cool is that? So that's historical markers. There's something about stepping back into history to remind what it was. The other thing that I like to do is I like to look at pictographs and pictographs and petroglyphs. This is outside Moab, Utah. These paintings were done at the time of Abraham. That's how old these are. Historical markers. They don't even know who did these. It wasn't the current Native American culture that exists today. It was a culture they did not know. But it was really eerie because we were standing there by ourselves in this canyon outside of Moab, Utah. And as you walked around, those eyes followed you. It was super creepy. But historical markers, they left their mark. This said something. You look at it and you're like, I don't know what it said. But it said something to the natives that were there. Several years ago, we drove down to Fort Hennis. Some of you may have been there, outside of Grand Mound, where there was a fort that was built in the 1850s during the Indian Wars of Washington State. And you can go to that very spot. And there's still a church that exists on that spot from about the same period of time. How fascinating is that? This is one of my favorites. If you know anything about Wenatchee, I grew up in Wenatchee, as you know, just north of Wenatchee is Earthquake Point. Massive earthquake in the 1870s in western Washington and eastern Washington that actually dammed the Columbia River for a period of time. Fascinating. The whole thing just caved into the river. You can still see the rocks out in the water. But this is one of my favorites. So one of my great heroes of the past, historical heroes, is Joshua Chamberlain. He was a school teacher who became a brigadier general in the Civil War. He only became a brigadier general because they thought he was dead, but he became that. But he was a school teacher who was the hero at Gettysburg, at least one of them. This is where the 20th Maine set up and repelled attack after attack, if you know that story, of the Confederate soldiers, and to stand there and see the hillside that the Confederate soldiers were coming up on. To stand there and see that and to be there at that point. The The rocks are still piled up. You get the feel of history. And then, as you know, of course, he ordered that incredible bayonet charge down the hill. Fascinating story. But when you're in these places, there's something about that that helps us to visualize our past, to relive those events. I don't know if you're like me. I may be a little bit weird, and I'm okay with that. But when I go to a place, I try to imagine what this place looked like 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Like, to me, that's fascinating. Again, maybe it's because I was born outside my time. I don't know. But scriptures are like this. God loved historical markers to teach revelatory history to the following generations. He's always been a visually oriented God, and that makes sense. He created us. He knows how we live. And so he had these visual markers throughout history for the people of Israel. The first one being the tabernacle itself. The tabernacle and later the Solomonic temple. That was clearly a visualization of Eden. It was a remake of Eden where God had his initial temple, and then when he goes to the people of Israel and says, hey, I want to dwell with my people again, big surprise that he would remake the temple much like it was in Eden. Even to the point, the thing that we call the menorah, that was, looks very stylistic, that's not the way it probably was to begin with. It was a representation of the tree of life, right there. Like right there in the middle of the tabernacle was life itself, which was now accessible to the people. Or think of the animal sacrifices of the Old Testament. They were a visual as well as an olfactory reminder of what it was like and what sin does to a holy God. You think about the smells of that burning flesh all the time. That was a reminder of the heinous nature of sin. So God always did this, and sometimes he had them do their own historical markers. Remember at the Passover, remember the Passover, that 10th plague, these 10 plagues, each of which was aimed at a particular Egyptian god, and the last one aimed at the god Ra himself, because the Pharaoh was considered to be Ra. And so when Pharaoh's son died, Ra died, and Yahweh won. But remember, the people of Israel, if they went through a particular series of sacrifices and bloodset, they would be saved from death. And what God tells the people of Israel at that point is he tells them, this is a reminder, and I want you to do it forever and ever, because it's a reminder for your children. God saved us from Egypt. And so every time that they would reinstitute that Passover feast, it was a reminder of what God had done with the 10 plagues in Egypt that was still in the memory of people hundreds of years later in the ancient Near East. Or think about it when you think about, there was a story in Numbers 16 where Korah and a couple of other dudes decide to rebel against Aaron and Moses. And they're like, hey, we're all the same. And so therefore, we can be just as much priest and leader as you. So we're going to do that. And so Moses, rightly so, says, okay, let's put together a contest and see who God chooses. So he says, hey, show up with your 250 dudes tomorrow with your little brass censers and come up and we'll see who God chooses to be priest. And if you remember the story, first of all, Moses says, if this is right and I am the leader and Aaron is the priest, the world, you're going to see something you've never seen before. The earth is going to open up and swallow up these dudes and then close back up. And that's exactly what happens to Korah and his two buddies and their families. But for the 250 guys who had the censers, God brings fire from heaven, destroys them all, and then instructs Aaron to go out, and his sons to go out and collect the 250 censers that are laying on the ground. They remelt them, and it becomes plating for the altar. So when you walked into the tabernacle or the temple, the first thing you saw was this brass sheeting, like, blowing in the wind to remind you about God's leadership. Visual reminders. The last one is one that you probably know even more so, is when the people of Israel are now ready to cross into the promised land. They're ready to go, and they're right opposite Jericho. And as soon as the priests' feet hit the Jordan River at flood, it dries up, and the people cross on dry ground. What you may not know is it dries up from the city of Adam to the Dead Sea. That's a 20-mile swath. It's not like the little trickle thing that you oftentimes see where they walk through, one at a time. You had 1 million people. 20-mile swath for the people to get across. And so Joshua says, here's what I'd like you to do. I want you to take 12 stones, put them in the middle of the river, 12 stones on the side of the river, and that becomes a permanent memorial. So when you're out walking the dog with your children and the sons say, what do those rocks mean? This is what God has done. Historical reminders. We have them for our country. God had them for the people of God. But other times, God used visible images to communicate the truth of an event that was not visible. One such image was that of anointing with oil. So the most common oil, Nate, you talked about this a few weeks ago. The most common oil was that of olive oil. This is a period piece from the first century of Palestine. And what they would do is the person would kneel in front, presumably, we don't have the exact, and then the leader would then pour the oil over the head of the person who was being designated for service. And the imagery was that of filling of the Spirit. So it was a visual imagery of being filled with the Spirit of God. So the oil coming upon them, interestingly enough, that's the same verb that's oftentimes used in the Old Testament for the filling of the Spirit. The Spirit came upon them. So when they were anointed with oil, they were filled with the Holy Spirit. And the idea of filling of the Holy Spirit, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament as well, is that you had a skill. You had something that you were good at, and God then called you into service to perform that skill, and then gave you the supernatural power to do it well. Like the guys who carved the tabernacle doors were filled with the Spirit. They were craftsmen already, but you can't have idiot marks on the tabernacle door where God lives. If you understand idiot, okay. If you've done construction, you know what that means. But you can't have that. And so these guys were filled with the Spirit, and they built their tabernacle. And so the idea is that whomever was anointed was then empowered by God to perform that service. We're going to see today in today's passage, because you're probably thinking, how is this dealing with today's passage? This is where Jesus defines his mission. He has been filled with the Spirit of God. We saw that in chapter 3, right? He's filled with the Spirit of God in chapter 3, and the Spirit comes upon him. And I'm going to be honest, there's a lot of confusion about who Jesus is to this point in Luke. Remember, the writers of the Gospels, they're writing particular people at particular times. We're going to talk about that when we get to the end of this. So he was filled with the Spirit of God. God empowered them. We see that whether it's a prophet, Elisha is anointed by God. The priests, Aaron and his sons, are anointed by God. Saul, the first king of Israel, is anointed by Samuel. But then because of his failure, the Spirit is taken from him in 1 Samuel and given to David. Saul now loses his ability to be supernaturally empowered to serve as king. And now David is king. So you remember when in Psalm 51, when David says after his sin with Bathsheba, he's like, please don't take your Spirit from me. He's not talking about salvation. He's talking about empowerment for service. He wanted to stay king. And so in his repentance, he's asking God, please don't take your Spirit from me like you took him from Saul because of his disobedience. So the question keeps coming up because of the confusion. The disciples are confused about who Jesus is. The people are confused. The religious leaders are confused. The political leaders are confused. So the question keeps coming up, Who is this Jesus? And that's what we're going to look at today in chapter 9, verses 18 through 22. So looking at verse 18, and it came about while he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he questioned them, saying, "Who do the multitudes say that I am?" So Jesus is going to ask his disciples the same question that Herod has been asking earlier in the chapter. Remember earlier in chapter 9, Herod's like, who is this guy? And the question, the statements that the disciples give is very similar to what Herod hears. Some say it's Elijah. Some say it's one of the prophets. Some say it's John the Baptist. You can imagine Herod's concept of like, it can't be like I cut his head off. Like he can't be back from the dead. But Herod doesn't know who he is either. Who is this man? And in reality, what Luke does is he's going to compare and contrast Herod with Peter's statement. So Herod's like, who is this man? And he tried to find him. Peter's like, I got an idea of who you are. But when he says that, oftentimes we hear that that was a declaration. I'm not convinced it was. We'll talk about that. So the two events are compared and contrasted, Herod's unbelief and Peter's belief. This is one of the 7 times that Luke tells us that Jesus went off by himself. And it seems like when we read the other gospel writers that the period, remember the previous context is the feeding of the 5,000. From what the other gospel writers, there was a lot of time between that and this event. So in my mind, it's not connected to that, this little narrative. It's really connected to what's going to happen afterwards, which I'm not going to touch on. It'll be preached next week. But it actually fits better for this narrative. And the disciples are with him. So it's obvious Jesus is by himself praying, and the disciples are close by. And what Jesus is praying, I believe, because this is a different getting away. Most of the time, Jesus got away from the crowds. We've talked about this before in a previous sermon because of messianic fervor. Like the people kept believing that if he's the Messiah, where's the army? Let's get them together. Let's overthrow Rome. Let's do what we need to do to conquer and reestablish Israel as a real nation. And every time it came to that, remember we talked about what happened to the other people that said that they were Messiah? Do you remember? They were all killed by the Romans. And so Jesus could not be killed that way. He has to walk into Jerusalem willingly, knowing what's going to take place. And so this is a different getting away. I think this is Jesus getting away, praying to the Father, because remember, he says, I don't do anything except the Father tells me or directs me, which sounds really strange because Jesus is God, I get that. But that's a whole different theological lesson than today. But like he comes to Father, he's like, is it time? Because this is going to be the first time on a human's lips that Jesus is going, that a human declares who Jesus is in Luke, and Jesus is going to declare his very mission. So his disciples are with him. He prayed alone. They were close by, and he questioned them, saying, who do the multitudes say that I am? That is, what role or mission do the crowd see me fulfilling? Maybe the prophet announced by Moses in Deuteronomy 18, Moses said, look, there's going to be a prophet that arises among the people one day, and you will listen to him as opposed to me. That could possibly be. Or the Messiah King, which is what the people believe. Like they were ready to have Jesus raise up an army and destroy the Roman influence. But up to this point, the mission and purpose of Jesus is ambiguous at best. I mean, he's done miracles. We've seen that. He's challenged the authorities. We've seen that. He's taught in the synagogues. But really, what is his mission? He talked about preaching the kingdom. We have that. But what is that? And how does that play in the nature of what we're looking at today? Now, under the guidance of prayer to the Father, Jesus begins to narrow his focus on his true mission. And he's going to turn his eyes towards Jerusalem. All of the gospel writers, or the first 3, the synoptic, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all of them have Jesus in Galilee. And then at some point in their text, he turns towards Jerusalem and said, I got to go. Unlike John, who's back and forth to Jerusalem all the time, This is his turning towards Jerusalem time. So they answered him, verse 19. They answered him and said, John the Baptist, and others say Elijah. Others say that you're one of the prophets who's risen again. So again, John the Baptist's question to the disciples, I'm going to say, is a bit of a setup. And Luke places this narrative close to Herod, as I already said, his own desire to know Jesus, to know who is this man. He was, and the disciples repeat much of what Herod has already heard. Jesus' declaration will state the who, but also the what in verse 22. But others say Elijah. Some say John the Baptist. We know he's dead. We already got that. Like, he's dead. This is not John. John's already said, like, I've come to announce you. So we know it's not John the Baptist. But remember, they're just talking about what the multitudes say. Others say that you're Elijah, which would make sense because in a lot of the things that Jesus says sounds very Elijah-like, especially in the gospel writers. Some say that you're Elijah. Elijah, remember, one of the prophets of the Old Testament in the book of Kings. He's the one who fought with the prophets of Baal, the priests and priestesses of Baal, and the fire coming down and all of that. You're one of the prophets raised from the dead or risen again. Interesting, Mark doesn't say risen again. Luke does, probably because what Jesus is going to say in verse 22. So here, this is anticipation of this narrative in 22, which Jesus is going to say. However, because of Israel's, that is the people's messianic anticipation, the crowds identified him as a deed from God, like they get that part, but not the long-anticipated Messiah. There's no army, no call to arms, no Rome. The Romans still held power, but Jesus is about to change all of that, not only for his disciples, but as the crowds as well. So he said to them, but who do you say that I am? Now he's talking to the 12. And the way he writes that, the you is emphatic. Like, you 12, who do you say that I am? And Peter answered and said, you are the Christ of God. So all of Luke has been leading up to this narrative. His miracles, his teachings, were all leading to this declaration by Peter. The first three gospel writers, as I said, all have him in Galilee. Now he's going to turn his face towards Jerusalem. Who do you say I am? You are the Messiah from God. Remember in chapter 5, verse 21, the crowds ask, who is this man who speaks blasphemy? Chapter 7, verse 49, who is this man that even forgives sins? Chapter 8:25, who is this that he commands the wind and the waves? Chapter 9, Herod said, who is this man? And so Peter answers and said, you are the Christ of God. And you know, the word, like when I used to teach college back in the day, I would remind people that Jesus Christ, Christ was not his last name. It wasn't like Jesus Christ, Michael Stufflebeam. That was not his last name. It was a designation. Christ is Christos, which means the one who's been anointed. And it comes from the Hebrew of the Old Testament, Mashiach, meaning the anointed one. So it's somebody that God has anointed with the Spirit of God to do whatever the mission was that they had. And here, Peter says, you are the Christ of God. You are the anointed one. You are the Mashiach of the Old Testament. The long-anticipated Messiah, the seed promised in Genesis 3:15, the key promise of the Abrahamic covenant. Remember, the land, seed, blessing. You are the seed. The servant of Isaiah, the Messiah, the Mashiach. Peter made this confession, but I'm going to be honest, he did not fully understand what he was saying. Remember, we know, because we have the hindsight to our benefit, we know that there were two comings, or there's going to be a second coming of Messiah. Even Peter says in his epistles, like, the prophets struggled with time. They couldn't figure out how Jesus could be the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 and the coming king in the other of the writings. How can that be? How can you die and be king? So they struggled with that time concept. But the first coming of Messiah is what we're talking about here. The second coming, still into the future. Now, because we have, from a narrative standpoint, we have a narrator who's already told us things, we already know that he's the Christ. The angels announced this in chapter 2, verse 11. They announced that this is the Christ. The narrator, that is Luke himself, tells us that this is the Christ. The demons in chapter 4 say, you are the Christ. So we have everybody else, except humanity, declaring him to be the Christ. And so when Peter says, you are the Christ of God, this is the first time in the book of Luke that a human has declared Jesus' mission. You are the Christ of God. But because of Peter's and the disciples' still simple understanding of what it meant for Jesus being the Messiah, because remember, they were still looking for the kingdom. In just a few verses, they're going to argue, just like in a good collectivist culture based on honors, they're going to argue who's going to be greatest in the kingdom. They're still waiting for that to take place. They didn't get this, even what Jesus was saying. And later on in the book, in 9:44, Jesus is going to say again, I'm going to die. And it says that not only did Jesus hide the meaning from them, but the disciples didn't even ask about it. And I don't know which came first, chicken, egg thing. But they didn't even ask, what do you mean you're going to die? Who's going to be greatest? Let's get to that question first. That's where they were at. But in this culture, they didn't understand that first coming, that second coming. And I have to wonder. So you remember as a kid and your parents would ask you a question and you would answer, and remember the comment, this is in Parenting Book 101, are you asking me or are you telling me, right? I have to wonder whether when Peter made this, it was less of a declaration and more of, I don't know, Christ of God? Because he doesn't get it. Later on, and we'll look at a couple of passages where this happens again, but he instructed, and so he says, this was the beginning of belief, but just the beginning. Jesus would have to clarify for them. And frankly, if you read the gospel writers, he has to go through it and die and rise from the dead before the disciples are okay, now this makes sense. So Jesus instructed them, warned them and instructed them, don't tell this to anyone. We've seen this multiple times in the book of Luke. And notice the repetition, instructed, warned, and instructed. That's good Hebrew, even though Luke was not writing as a Hebrew, but that's repetition, it means emphatic. I don't want you ever to tell people this right now. Much like the leper who was healed and the demons who declared him as Messiah, Jesus tells them not to disclose it. There's still the danger of that messianic fervor. If they go around and say, this is the Messiah, what are the people going to do? They're going to start raising an army, and Jesus is going to find himself, as we saw, one of the Messiahs, dead in a canyon outside of Jericho. And so that cannot be. So the warning is not because Peter's statement was false, but because it's true. And there is a misconception of what that would look like to the general population. So this is Jesus' statement where he is going to turn his face to Jerusalem and make that declaration of what is going to happen to him. Now in Luke, it's a little different than in the other writers. He makes this declaration he's in the Galilean ministry from 4:14 through 9:17, but then he devotes 10 chapters of getting to Jerusalem. And a lot of stuff happened in those 10 chapters, and finally, in 1928, he arrives at Jerusalem. So he's I'm going to Jerusalem, but I got to wait get these 10 chapters, and there's parables, there's all kinds of teachings in that section, but he makes it in chapter 19. He gets to Jerusalem. But this is what he says, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things. I emphasized the word must, and this is why I spelled the initial thing the way I did. This is the Greek word dei, D-E-I, in our English. Delta, don't worry about it. But this is the Greek word dei. It was a word that said necessity. It was a word that was used by the gospel writers to say what was going to take place was pre-planned, preset, and had to happen this way. That is a necessity. It is a must. It is a plan that has to be executed because it was made by the Godhead himself well before we existed as humans. So the gospel writers use this word to express from Jesus' lip his destiny. He is clarifying for the learning disciples that their understanding of the kingdom is incomplete. There's a first coming of Messiah, and that's what I'm going to tell you about right now. That the Son of Man must suffer many things. And that both is physical suffering, the word that's used there, as well as emotional suffering, leading up to the cross. And think about him at the Garden of Gethsemane. Lord, if there's any possibility, take this from me. Right? Any other way, take this cup, take this judgment of God from me. But he is also going to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. And there's a way it's written in the original. Like these are 4 very clear statements of what's going to take place. He's going to suffer, he's going to be rejected, he's going to be killed, and he's going to be raised up. So the program, this is the program. This is the day. He was born today, DEI. He was born, this is the program of God. His life to the cross was a necessity, a plan discussed and determined prior to creation. Possibly this was also the nature of his prayer at the beginning of the passage. God determined for him the time when he was going to say, enough of the preparatory work, it's time to go. Now you need to go to Jerusalem and be rejected, to suffer, be killed, and raised up on the 3rd day. In the disciples' mind, how can this be? If he's going to be the king of the kingdom, even more powerful is the following narrative that Luke advances. If indeed you want to be a disciple of Jesus, you must take up your cross and follow and be ready to die with and for him. Let me explain. So this is that. He was born today. He was born to die. Years ago, I did a whole sermon on that Greek word, and I wrote a poem to go along with that. And I want to do that before I get to my so what. Because it struck me, and this was written at a time of Christmas. It was a Christmas sermon that I did. But like it just struck me as they're looking at that baby in the manger. This was his destiny. So born to die, how can it be this babe so small will face the tree? He looks so small and helpless yet this small babe will soon help me. This humble birth where sheep bed down speaks nothing of the coming crown. In Bethlehem, not in Rome, a king is born without a throne. They do not celebrate his birth with parties, festival, and mirth, yet from this humble, lowly birth will grow a king to change the earth. This is his call, his destiny, to one day die upon that tree. This still small child of modest birth has come to lowly planet earth. He came a babe, and yet a king to take from death its painful sting. For so the babe in manger lay, was born but for one fateful day. No greater love can man receive than this young baby's destiny. So as we celebrate the birth of this small Savior come to earth, remember too that this small child was fortuned not for meek and mild. And as we gaze on baby small, see both the newness and the pall. Born to die, how can it be this babe so small will face the tree? Born to die, how can it be that this small child will die for me? So the so what? So I don't want to take away from next week's sermon. Are you preaching it, Nate? Okay, I won't say much. So to me, this next section is Luke's so what? So when we look at this, remember each of the gospel accounts are purposeful. Luke writes in a very distinct way as opposed from Mark and Matthew and John. And they narrated their story of Jesus to fit both their purpose as well as their audience. And do you remember who Luke's audience is? a God-fearer named Theophilus. We always have to keep that in mind because he's writing to Theophilus. We are a secondary audience, but we're not the primary audience. When Luke was writing this, he did not know that we would be at Fellowship Bible Church in the year 2024. He probably didn't even think that there was going to be a 2024, and time hadn't even been invented yet, so it wouldn't matter. So when he's doing that, like he's writing to Theophilus, so we always have to keep that in our brain when we're trying to figure out the so what. Because when you're preaching and when you're teaching and you find the so what of the passage, that becomes our so what. Because that's the word of God to us. So here in Luke, we have Jesus turning his face towards Jerusalem. According to the gospel writers, he was in Caesarea Philippi. He was a long ways away. But I just envision Jesus turning towards Jerusalem and saying, this is what I must do. This is what must happen. This is my destiny. But also remember, again, Luke's audience. One way to understand the purpose of a passage is to compare and contrast it with the other gospel writers. When Matthew tells this story, okay, when Matthew tells this story, we have Peter making this statement, who do you say that I am? Peter's like, you are Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered almost in parallel, well, your name is Peter, son of Jonah. Like he names his father, Jesus names his father. But then he makes a statement about Peter because he was Simon, son of Jonah. And he's like, but I'm going to call you Petros. I'm going to call you Peter because upon this Petra, I will build my church. And so in Matthew, the whole emphasis on that statement is really on Peter's future leadership in this coming thing called the church. So big surprise in Acts chapter 2, who's leading the way? It's Petros. He is a Petra. He is a foundational stone of what's going to be called the church. In Mark 8, when Mark gives us this narrative, Peter's also forefront. And in Peter makes the declaration and then privately pulls Jesus inside and said, you can't do this. Like, this can't happen. Like, whatever the case, like, you can't, we'll take care of you. And do you remember what Jesus said to him? Get behind me, Satan. Because here you have Peter trying to keep him from his mission. But when we look at Luke, there's no narrative about Peter. He immediately goes into Nate's sermon of next week, but he immediately goes right into the next. If anyone wants to be a follower of me, take up your cross and come after me. He's just said, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be killed, and I'm going to be raised from the dead. And if you want to be a disciple of mine, take up your cross. And I hope I don't steal this from you, Nate, but like the whole idea of Christ, we have cheapened that in our modern culture. Like we say things like, man, that was my burden to carry. Like that was tough. Like I lost $20. Like that was a burden, right? That's not what the cross means. The cross was a wooden instrument of torture that you would have to drag up to some place and get ready to be nailed to it and be ready to die. That's what Jesus says. You want to be a disciple of mine? Get your cross and come after me. So Luke doesn't mention either the future interactions with Peter, but he immediately begins to talk about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And it's an open invitation, if anyone. So the obvious so what is the teaching of verses 23 through to 7, which will be covered next week. If you're truly a disciple of Jesus, one of the 12, one of the 70 that's in chapter 10, one of the 120 in the upper room, one of the millions that followed, or a God-fearer named Theophilus, what's it mean to be a full disciple of Christ? How committed is your discipleship? Are you willing to take up the cross? Like Jesus. That's Luke's so what. So the question to disciples is the same question to us today. Two questions, really. Who do you think Jesus is? And what does it mean to be a true disciple of Jesus? And the two are interrelated. Because how I see Jesus is going to play on how I follow Jesus. How you see him will determine how you live your life for him. Do you see him as the world sees him? a good teacher, maybe a prophet, maybe a Baptist, a miracle worker, a handy person to have around when things are difficult. Again, who do you say that he is? The problem with each of these and others is that we see him like a guy just like us. I will not put him first and foremost in my life, but rather an equal, a buddy, or someone I can manipulate to get my needs met. If indeed he is the Christ of God, he is the Messiah, the coming King for us. The King has been sacrificed for us. He is now the King who is coming to establish a kingdom of which all people who follow him as disciples will be a part of that kingdom. And if you are a true follower of his, how do you see him? If he's indeed the Christ of God, the Messiah from God himself, he deserves my worship, my awe, my amazement, my holiness, and my very life. We're the whole realm of nature mind that we're a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. How we view him actually is quite important. If he is only my Jesus when things are bad, a friend that I can complain to, then what about when we do experience suffering and rejection and hurt and sickness and death? Who is he then? The key is that we have a Christ who, because of his work in Jerusalem that he just mentioned, that he's going to die, because of his works in Jerusalem on the cross, experienced all of that and more for us. All of my hurts, my rejections, my loneliness, even death was placed on him, nailed to the cross, and his death gave me life here and the life hereafter. And since indeed he is a God, he can be our helper, our healer, and our hope, more so than a friend. So again, who do you say that he is? And how does that affect your discipleship with him? In your handout today, you'll find a list of questions. So Dave Paulison, a writer Randy reminded me of this week, has a list of questions in chapter 7 of his book, Seeing with New Eyes, about, he calls them X-ray questions. How do you really determine where you're at in following as a disciple of Jesus Christ? So he says, I'm just going to read you a couple of his passages. One view of motivation will align and color every detail of theory and practice. Human motivation has to do with him, that is Christ. These questions that you have, and they're abbreviated, that's why they're not numbered. I took some of them out because if I gave you the whole list, you probably wouldn't read it. I'm just being honest. I was a teacher once. I know long lists does not work. These questions reveal functional gods, who actually controls their particular actions, thoughts and emotions, attitudes, memories, and anticipations. So the questions reveal, what is my truly functional God? Is it me, or is it the Christ of God? And so he says, your functional God competes with your professed God. Unbelievers who are wholly owned by ungodly motives, they're functional gods. Yet true believers are often severely compromised, distracted, and divided by our functional gods as well. So each of the X-ray questions circles around to the same basic issue. Who or what is your functional God? So I'm not asking you to read them now. You can if you choose. But this is something that if you want to evaluate, where is my discipleship? This is one way. Who do I follow? Who do I think Jesus is? And how has that affected my following after him? So I've been reading a book, and it's a study that I've been doing for a while, on the difference between individualist and collectivist cultures. So we live in an individualistic culture. It's very, very obvious. It means what I want is what I want, and if I don't get it, then I'll yell and scream, and all the other things that we know about individualist cultures. But what it does, it only affects me. U.S., Britain, that's about it in individualist cultures. The rest of the world is a collectivist culture. What I do not only reflects on my family, it reflects on my culture, it reflects on my community. That's how they lived. And in the ancient Greco-Roman world in which Paul grew up, in which Jesus grew up, there was a type of relationship called a patronage relationship. And some of the imagery of our relationship with Christ is based on this patronage relationship. So a patronage relationship was a reciprocal relationship between unequal parties. There was a patron who was greater, and then there was a client who was weaker. And the client needed something from the patron that he could not do himself or herself. So I would go to the patron and I would ask for whatever I needed. But what it did is it set me into a reciprocal relationship. I talked in one of the earlier sermons on the 3 graces. Like the word grace is a relationship word. We think of it as what God has done for us because we're an individualist culture. But grace actually has 3 dimensions. It's the gift that was given to me, the giver who gave it to me, and my response back to the giver. That was grace, all 3 of them. It's usually pictured as 3 sisters. The word charis, which is the word, you have charis, you have pistis, which is faith. These are relationship words. So I am in a reciprocal, unequal relationship with my patron God. You are as well, as a disciple of Jesus Christ. And when a gift was given, he did not earn the gift, but he would be expected to reciprocate that gift. That is discipleship, showing gratitude. And in the ancient world, if a patron gave a client a gift, and the client received it and did what he needed to do, every day that client would show up at the patron's door and ask one question: is there anything you need me to do today? That's relationship. That's discipleship. Showing up at our patron's door every day and asking God, is there anything you need me to do for you today? That's relationship. So the Stoic Seneca, whom my son just wanted to borrow his book, but he was a Stoic philosopher, believed this. Homicides, tyrants, thieves, adulterers, robbers, sacrilegious men and traitors, there will always be. But the worse than all of these is the crime of ingratitude. That's the patron-client relationship. That's what we have. That is relationship with God. So who do you think Jesus is? And where's your discipleship? Father, we thank you that you are a great God. We thank you that you have given us such abundant gifts that we can't even begin to repay. Lord, and all you ask is for us to reciprocate that in our lives, in the ways that we live for you, in the things that we can do for you. Lord, I pray that you will be with each one of us as we look at this list, Lord, and help us to understand more clearly what you want from us in this very individualistic world, Lord. May we be that and do that for you. We ask everything in your blessed name. Amen.